Update 2. He said he didn't want to marry a feminist, so I told him that's misogyny and he dumped me anyway. The pattern became even more obvious with how he started treating my friends. My friend Issa is super woke, and we love having deep conversations about social issues and systemic problems that need addressing. When she'd come over to my place, Grayson would suddenly become really quiet and find excuses to go work on something in the other room. At first, I thought maybe he was just giving us space for girl talk, but then I realized he was actually avoiding her because he couldn't handle being around women who speak their minds and refuse to pretend everything's fine when it's not. He also started doing this really gross thing where he'd make subtle digs about my appearance when I dressed professionally or confidently. Like if I wore a blazer to work, he'd make some comment about how I looked intimidating or too serious. When I'd style my hair in a sleek ponytail, he'd say he preferred it down because it was softer and more feminine. It was like he was trying to push me toward being smaller and more palatable instead of appreciating the strong, confident woman he was supposedly dating. Classic manipulation tactics designed to make women doubt themselves. But the absolute worst incident was when we were watching a Netflix series about women in corporate environments, and there was a scene dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace. I made a comment about how unfortunately common that actually is and how most women have experienced some form of it, and he literally rolled his eyes and said, "Here we go again. Here we go again," like discussing real issues that affect millions of women was some kind of burden for him to endure rather than an opportunity to learn and show empathy. I should have ended things right then and there, but I actually believed I could help him understand if I just approached it the right way. I thought maybe he was just sheltered and needed someone to open his eyes to what was really happening in the world around us. I genuinely believed that with patience and the right educational resources, I could help him become a better person and a real ally. God, I was so naive to think someone could change when they clearly had no interest in doing the work. After those concerning incidents, I decided I needed to be more intentional about helping Grayson understand important social justice issues. I really believed deep down that he was just uninformed and needed someone to guide him toward developing a better understanding of systemic problems. So I started being more strategic about sharing educational content with him and creating opportunities for meaningful conversations about oppression and inequality. I'd send him well-researched articles throughout the day about things like gender pay gaps, workplace discrimination, and how patriarchal systems actually hurt everyone, men included. I figured if I could show him the data and statistics from credible sources, he'd finally realize how wrong his initial reactions had been and start taking these issues seriously. When he wouldn't respond to my texts about the articles, I'd bring them up during dinner or when we were hanging out, trying to create space for him to process the information and ask questions. He'd just kind of nod along politely, but I could tell he wasn't really absorbing any of the important information I was sharing with him. It was like talking to a wall. Sometimes he'd give me these blank stares when I tried to explain concepts like intersectionality or systemic privilege. The most frustrating part was how he'd completely shut down whenever I tried to have real conversations about how these issues affected our daily lives and relationships. Like when I tried to explain how his reaction to my friend Allah was probably rooted in internalized misogyny and discomfort with women who challenged traditional gender roles, he accused me of psychoanalyzing everything and said I was reading too much into what he claimed were just normal social interactions. But that's exactly the problem. These interactions aren't normal when you actually understand the bigger picture of how society conditions us to react to strong women. I also started paying more attention to his friend group, and honestly, it explained so much about his resistance to growth. Trevor and his other buddies were exactly the type of guys you'd expect. They'd make borderline offensive jokes about women and then act like anyone who didn't laugh just couldn't take a joke. When I'd point out why certain comments were problematic and harmful, they'd all exchange these looks like I was being overly dramatic or sensitive. Meanwhile, Grayson would just sit there silently instead of educating them about why their behavior was unacceptable. The breaking point with his toxic friend group happened at a sports bar where we went to watch some game. One of his buddies made this completely gross comment about our waitress's body, and when I said that was objectifying and disrespectful, they all started laughing and saying I was being too uptight. Grayson just sat there like a complete coward instead of calling out their disgusting behavior. Later, he actually had the audacity to tell me I was embarrassing him by standing up against sexism, like fighting objectification was somehow more embarrassing than tolerating it. That's when I realized the real problem wasn't just Grayson's ignorance about feminist issues, it was his complete unwillingness to grow, learn, and challenge himself or others. He was perfectly content existing in his comfortable little bubble of privilege without ever examining his role in perpetuating harmful systems. I tried explaining to him that when you know better, you have a responsibility to do better, but he kept insisting he didn't want our relationship to be all about politics all the time. But here's what he refused to understand. This isn't politics, it's basic human rights and dignity. The fact that he could just ignore these issues because they didn't directly affect him showed exactly how privileged and out of touch he really was. I started to see that what I had initially interpreted as simple ignorance was actually willful blindness and resistance to change, which is honestly even worse than not knowing. I kept trying, though, because I really believed our relationship was worth fighting for and that he had the potential to become a better person. I'd share more educational articles, try to have patient conversations about why representation matters, explain how microaggressions work and impact people's daily lives. I even suggested we watch some documentaries together about social justice movements, but he'd always make excuses about being tired from work or wanting to just relax during our free time together. Looking back now, I can see that I was basically doing all the emotional labor of trying to educate and improve him while he just coasted along, benefiting from my efforts without putting in any real work himself. He was happy to let me do all the heavy lifting of growth and education while he remained comfortable in his ignorance. That's exactly the kind of dynamic that feminism exists to challenge and change. Everything came to a head about 3 weeks ago, and I still can't believe how terribly he reacted when I finally tried to have an honest conversation about our future together. We were at his place making dinner, and I brought up the idea of moving in together since we'd been discussing it for weeks. But this time, I wanted to make sure we were actually compatible on the important values and principles before taking that major step in our relationship.